Hey, I wanted to share a little thing I was recommended. In a top-down YIV RPG game. Art looking stellar, but more importantly, the writing feels competent. Currently, we only got a little Act 1 demo, but what I've seen so far is looking pretty good. I'm gonna go over a few of the characters and situations and talk about what I liked and where I felt it could use a little change. We can start with talking about the characters and specifically about the Otter Boy, cause I think he's a really good example of what the game does well. Let me pull up an example. Talking with Mr. Otter, we learn that he owns a store called the Musty Musclet. If we then choose to ask him about the name, he will then tell us that the odd name comes from when his store used to be a bar. Apparently, the town folk barely drink, so he turned his bar into a general store instead. Through this little snippet of dialogue, we learn not only about him, but also about the town. Something as tiny as the name of his store is used to flesh out multiple things at the same time, while also being its own little story. This is a pretty short dialogue, but the game accomplishes a lot with it. And similarly, everything this boy says is jam-packed with interesting details. Every gossip topic we can go through with him serves multiple purposes. We learn about the town, about him, about his backstory, about his values. There's a bit where he teaches the player about actual economy. Dialogue with all the characters works like this too, very quickly getting around to a bunch of interesting stuffs. The Otter was just where I felt like it was executed the bestest. The game itself is pretty linear. You complete quests in linear ways. At least I haven't found more than one way to get through any of the quests. I don't think this is a deal breaker at all. If games like these are always made by small teams, often just one or two peeps doing as much as they can in their free time. So I'm not expecting a New Vegas level dynamic world or anything like that. I do think there could be done a little more to add a personalized feel to the game. And I do think you could do this without it demanding too many resources. First, I want to mention I'm a dumb piece of shit and I know nothing about making games, so I want to make it clear that what I'm saying now is just uneducated assumptions. But as an example, there's a quest where the player goes to the dark forest on an errand, and when you return, the mouse character has a small chat with you. Now imagine instead if this was dynamic, so whatever character you had gossiped with the most would show up to talk to instead. This should mean that you only have to write a bit of dialogue for the other characters, since you already have the image sprites. I guess you'd also have to code some sort of system that could detect who you've gossiped with the most, but I don't think that would be super complex. Again, discard everything I've just said if I don't get how coding works. But this is an RPG, and having the game respond to the player can do a lot to pull us into the world. There currently isn't a lot of player choice and dialogue. There's a few choices, but it's not a lot. So something like this to supply would be dope. The art in the game is great. The characters have a lot of attitude in their arts. Super cute. The art style is not very contemporary furry. It's almost a little Winnie the Pooh-ish. Got these very feral animals with super big eyes and really small paws. I really dig this style. It has a real wholesome aura about it, which I think is really fitting for this game. This is a good example of one of the dialogue arts from the game. I especially like this one because it captures the bunny's personality really well. The big head clearly meant for a farmer or someone else who works out in the sun with how big the brim is. The pink band around it giving it a kinda old lady vibe, and then her mischievous expression with hearts in her eyeballs. All of these showing us little elements of her character. The only art that I felt was off was the main boy's default art. He looked really sassy in this one, which is kinda odd because he doesn't have that kinda attitude. Oh yeah, and while we're at it, the Otter Boy makes a really sad expression for just one line when he gives you the loop. I'm assuming that's a mistake because it feels really out of nowhere. The porn side of the game is structured in an how do you describe this? There's a few sex scenes sprinkled throughout the game. There's 3 in total, but they're pretty short. I think what I might be missing is a little more text throughout these. Not that I don't appreciate the animation, I know that's a luxury when it comes to YIV, but that's why I want you to get the most out of this thingy by pairing it with a little more dialogue and juicy details in written form. Mitzi's is a guy who's pretty good at pairing text with animations, if you need an example. Let's look at Hazelnut's butt rot for a second. Here we get a bunch of dialogue. There's basically dialogue for every single action. Plus, we get some good ass details like temperature and smell. This shit gets all multi-sensory. Plus, we can also extend the length of your animation. Seeing the same thing getting looped is a lot less samey once we get some flavor in from the text side. Text and animation, it can work together, enhance each other. It doesn't just have to be one or the other. Otherwise, I think I like what the game is trying to do with the sex stuffs. A lot of the characters have smutty dialogue and there's plenty of mentions of sex. So I think what's going on is that the game tries to have the player constantly a little horny, a little on edge, and then whenever a sex scene happens, the player is ready. I think you always want to build up a little to the porn like that when you have an opportunity, because porn always feels better when there's a little bit of build-up. I like the idea of what the game is going for, and I've seen it pulled off goodly in other porn games too. Naked Order is a good example, but I don't always feels like Forest of Love pulls this off well. For example, there's a point in the game where you get a non-sexual quest. Even though there's been plenty of sexual dialogue so far, going on this thingy and figuring out things out is fun enough, but you fall kinda out of the horny mood doing this quest. Then you meet a character and have some non-sexual dialogue with him, and then there's an optional sex scene. But by now, all the build-up we've gotten from previous sex dialogues has kinda worn off, and there's not a lot of sex mood going currently. So this sex scene feels a bit shoehorned in, like it's a bit oddly placed. I think if you got longer non-sexual segments of the game, it'd be cool if you structured it so that the sex scenes only happen outside of the non-sexual segments. So we actually get the sexual tension and build up and the sex scenes around the same time. Either that or just always have a little sexual tension going. Otherwise, the sex scenes is cool. You clearly got the ardent chick, they looking good, interesting angles on it. I like the mouse running into us after the harvest scene, making for little bits of an awkward scenario. That added some fun spice. That made for an experience, good shit. Otherwise, yeah, that's what I had to say about Act 1. I'm looking forward to more of this game. This looks very promising. That it? Eat your vegetables.